Just give me a moment while the YouTube is loading up. And I think that looks about right. There we are. Okay. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending upon where you are and when you're watching this. We are going to look tonight at the tip of the iceberg, a small sampling of halakha, of Jewish law dealing with money. Jewish law has a lot to say about how we conduct our financial affairs, because of course the Torah was written as a guidance for not only our private activities and our religious spirituality, but also to regulate the interaction between different people. And nothing needs as much clarity as the buying and selling between people. This is an area of life that can cause a great deal of strife and stress and a lot of conflict and court cases. As such, the Torah gives us quite a lot of information, which our sages have helped to explain to us in greater detail. What we do today, though, will only be a tiny, tiny taste of some of the laws, hopefully enough that it will whet your appetite for more, and hopefully enough that it will also guide you for at least some of the more common or basic activities. We're going to cover things that are involved in buying and selling. We'll also cover the issue of theft, which usually has a monetary dimension. And we will also finish off with the topic of tzedakah. Although not purely a money matter, I think it'll fit all right in our topic tonight. Just a little housekeeping before we get underway. Tonight and next week's class will be the final two classes of Pathway to Judaism for 5782. So we will be going on break after next week's class for quite some time. So please stay tuned to the posts on the website for upcoming events and activities, but Pathway to Judaism will be finished after next Thursday evening. So let's get down to the basics of business. Of course, we know from the Ten Commandments, do not steal is kind of very prominent. We also know in Leviticus that this concept of not stealing is expanded upon and coupled with the idea of do not deal falsely, do not lie to one another, do not swear by my name falsely so that you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. The idea of swearing here would be that swearing was commonly used as a way of declaring one's position in a dispute, as a way of saying, I swear that he made a deal with me, or some such statement. Obviously, there would have been no way to check in many of the ancient situations of who was and who was not right. And so reminding people that swearing by God when you know you are lying is a pretty terrible thing to do. Additionally, do not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired servant shall not remain with you all night until the morning. We're going to go into more detail about what that oppression here means. But of course, it's a very stark reminder that both employee has an obligation to the employer, but the employer has also a huge obligation to the employee. And paying wages in a timely manner is one of those major obligations. And if you sell anything to your neighbor, or buy of your neighbor's hand, you shall not wrong one another. Jewish law, as we will see, protects both the buyer and the seller in our transactions. So those are some of the general statements about business that are found in the Torah. Not exhaustive at all. We're not going to do the full concordance, but just a brief reminder of some of the points. When we get into the Mishnah, the rabbinic text, we can see a little bit more detail about how this whole buying and selling business works. An item is not acquired merely through a verbal agreement. This applies even when witnesses testify that people have reached an agreement. What does that mean? What is implied? A person says, I am selling you this house, or I am selling you this wine, and a price is fixed. The purchaser agrees and says, I have purchased it. The seller says, I have sold it. And they tell the witnesses, serve as witnesses that so-and-so has sold and so has purchased. Their words are of no consequence. They have not said anything that has legal standing. And we're going to come back to what it means to back out of a deal, but we have to get very clear from a legal point of view that merely agreeing verbally to a transaction does not make it a legally binding contract. It is as if they have never spoken to each other at all. The same applies with regard to a person who gives a gift and its recipient. Telling somebody, oh, I'm going to make you a gift tomorrow, I'm going to give you $100. Legally, that person does not have any way to hold you accountable if you don't give them $100 tomorrow. There are some social things that we're going to talk about, but legally, if you take them to court, you're not going anywhere in collecting. In Judaism, we need more than just words to establish a full sale and transfer of ownership. And that's why, if a purchaser paid for an article and it was destroyed by forces beyond his control before he took it, you buy a house and there is an earthquake and it destroys the house before you take possession, the purchaser may tell the seller, give me the article I purchased or return my money. Meaning, until it is in the purchaser's hands, in their legal authority, it still belongs to the seller. And that means if there is a catastrophe, the purchaser deserves to get a refund or the item itself. In the case of the house, obviously that wouldn't really be possible. But in the case of some other item, like buying a horse that was hit by lightning, then that could be exchanged for a different horse. Even though there are witnesses who saw that the article was destroyed by forces beyond control, the seller could not save it, and he was not lazy regarding the matter. The seller must return the money. For our sages ordained that a kinyan, an acquisition, is finalized through pulling. Let's give one more example. For a modern situation, you are buying a car from somebody and you count out the money into their hand, but before they can hand you the keys and thus be an acquisition that you have taken hold of, a tree falls and destroys the car. Well, technically at that point, even though you'd already handed over the money, it still belongs to the original owner. And that means they have to give you back your money or provide an exact replacement for the car that was destroyed. It is still theirs, and thus the loss is theirs, and the money returns to you. Now, as I said before, it technically only becomes yours once the exchange has happened and it's been transferred into your ownership and movement. But that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences if you make a deal and back out of it, even if legally you were allowed to. As we see here from both the Mishnah and the Talmud, whenever a person, Mishnah, whenever a person pays money but does not perform pulling on the produce, meaning does not take it with their hands, although the purchaser does not acquire the movable property, as we have explained, the person who retracts, whether the purchaser or the seller, is considered not to have conducted himself in a Jewish manner, even if the purchaser only made a deposit. If either parties involved retracts, that party is eligible to receive the title Mishapara. What this is saying is that legally it doesn't become the other person's property until the motion has taken place, until the pulling has happened. But when you have entered into an agreement, whether you are buyer or seller, you should fulfill that agreement. Legally, you cannot be compelled to, but it is going to be a social stigma against you. You will earn a reputation as someone who is untrustworthy in these matters, and that stigma will be damaging to you. And of course, if too many people engage in such behavior, it'll be damaging to the community. Exacted payment, Mishapara, from the generation of the flood and the generation of dispersion, meaning the Tower of Babel time, will ultimately exact payment from he who does not stand by his word. They are hinting that to behave in such a way, to be untrustworthy in your buying and selling when you give your word, is akin to the transgressions that led to the flood and that led to the dispersal of the Tower of Babel. So we are required to follow through, if at all possible, on any agreements that are made. We should be good to our word, even if we are not legally bound to be until the actual exchange takes place. When a person agrees to a transaction with a verbal commitment alone, it is appropriate for him to keep his word, even though he did not take any money at all, did not make a mark on the article he desired to purchase, nor leave security. If either the seller or the purchaser retracts, although they are not liable to receive the adjuration renegre, they are considered to be faithless, and the spirit of the sages does not derive satisfaction from them. Even if it is just, I'm going to come back tomorrow and buy the car, even if you didn't put a deposit down, even if you didn't put a mark to show that you had that intention, no matter what, even if it was just empty words with no witnesses, you still should come back and follow through. Legally, you cannot be held accountable for it, but you can certainly be held accountable by the community for behaving in such a way. Similarly, if a person promised to give a colleague a gift and failed to do so, he is considered to be faithless. When does the above apply? With regard to a small gift, because the recipient will depend on the promise, meaning he'll count on it, expecting it that he was given. With regard to a large gift, by contrast, the giver is not considered to be faithless if he retracts, because the recipient does not believe that he will give him these articles until he transfers ownership through a formal kinyan, a formal action. Give you an example. If somebody says, oh, it's great that you invited me to your party, I'm going to bring a couple six-packs for the party. If you say that, although technically the person can't take you to court if you fail to show up with them, recognize that they were relying upon you. They maybe didn't buy their own six-packs because they expected you to deliver on that, because such a offer, such a gift would be a very reasonable action for a person to take. On the other hand, if somebody says, oh, you're throwing a party, that's great. Tell you what, I'm going to empty out the liquor store and I'm going to bring every bottle you can imagine. It's going to be the most amazing thing ever. I'm going to bring 12 kegs. Yeah, if the person doesn't show up, no one believed them in the first place. That was just talking, and that gets ignored. So we do adjust our expectations, but the more I'm likely to expect that you'll follow through, the more responsibility you have to follow through. You might think that the weight would be given to the larger gift, but that is less important than how likely I am to rely, to depend, to really expect that you would make good on that statement. When we are buying and selling, there are also laws for how we handle the pricing and the negotiations. Whether one overreaches, which is a sort of English translation for this idea of oppressing a person through our buying or selling, whether they do that knowingly or are not aware that there is any fraud, ona'a is the technical term, in the sale, he is held liable. Meaning that if you sell something for the wrong amount, and we'll talk about what those amounts would be, even if it is just by an innocent mistake, not that you were deliberately trying to defraud the other person, you are still going to be held liable and will have to fix that transaction, make restitution, or as we'll see, also negate the entire sale. Now, how much does that work? How much is too much? How much does the overreaching have to be in order that he have to repay it? 1/6 of the value. That is considered fraud, in which the exchange is valid, but the defrauder has to pay the entire difference to the cheated person. So if I wanted to buy something and it was supposed to be $6, that was the real value of the item, but I charge you $7, which is 1/6 more than the actual value of the item. The purchase still stands, but I have to give you that dollar back. Now, notice it is the whole dollar. Since I charged too much at the first step, I can't give you back half the difference, thus reducing it to within the 1/6 margin. I have to give you back that full dollar. If I had charged you $6.50, then even though that may be slightly higher than the average market value of the item, the purchase would still stand. Indeed, if the overreaching is less than that, the defrauder doesn't have to repay anything, because it is the normal practice to waive the rights to frauds amounting to less than that. You normally know that prices are going to fluctuate at least a little. If the overreaching amounts to anything more than 1/6, I charge to $8, the exchange is void, and the cheated person may return the article and not buy it at all. The cheater, however, may not retract if the cheated person wishes the exchange to stand. So at $8 in our example, I, the buyer, would have every right to go back to you and say, hey, you charged me $8. I know that this is only worth $6 now. Give me my money back. Here is your item. That is perfectly fine, legal, and the court can enforce that. However, if the buyer is okay having paid $8 when they should have only had to pay $6, the seller cannot say, oh, you know what? If that person's a sucker, I bet I can find someone who will take it for even more. Let's cancel this, and I'll charge you, and I'll charge the next guy $9. No. If I, the buyer, am willing to let the purchase stand, the seller, the one who was doing the cheating, does not have the option of forcing it to be undone just because the value turns out to be beyond that threshold. But it's not only with regards to the cost that someone might make an error or defraud their customer or defraud their seller. It can also be with regards to quantity. If one sells commodities to another by measure or by weight or by number and has made even the slightest error, the difference must always be returned, because the laws of overreaching apply only to errors in value, while errors in quantity, the difference must be returned. So if I come to your store and I want to buy 100 apples and you give me 99 apples, even though that error of -1 apple may be within the 1/6 margin of error that happens as a normal thing, nonetheless, you still owe me an apple. You must give me that apple or pay me the value of that apple that's missing. Likewise, the buyer, if they realize that they have been given 101 apples, but they only paid for 100 apples, they too are required to give back the extra apple or to pay whatever the difference might have been. As it says, thus, if one has sold to another 100 nuts for a dinar, and it is found that there were 101 or 99, the transaction is valid, but the amount of the error must be returned to the aggrieved party. So too, if one has sold something and a defect of which the purchaser was unaware is found on the purchased article, the purchaser may return the article even after the lapse of many years, because this was a transaction in error. If you are buying something, you need to know what you are buying. If what you are buying is being misrepresented, or you're not being given all the information about it, then when that information is discovered, if it would materially have changed the purchase in the first place, then that purchase can be canceled and the money has to be returned. So, and this goes in both directions, buyer or seller, if there was something fishy going on. So just use the buyer example. If I was buying a house and it turns out that the house actually has a terrible problem in the foundation or something, and that was something that was already true at the time of the original purchase, and it is something that the owner knew in particular, but even if it weren't, but it could have been known, then that is something that could unravel the entire purchase and allow the buyer to get a refund. There is a lot of protection for both buyers and sellers in Judaism. We do not want people taking advantage of each other. The whole notion of getting one over on someone or beating them and taking advantage of them in a deal is simply the opposite of what Torah wants us to do in our business relationships. So too, the quality of our items also matters. When a person exchanges one article for another or one animal for another, they're trading, the laws of ona'ah do not apply. This is true even when he exchanges a needle for a necklace, something worthless for something expensive, or a lamb for a donkey. Donkeys are much more expensive than lambs. This person may desire the needle more than the necklace. So when we're talking about ona'ah, about oppressing or taking advantage of someone, we are only talking about that with regards to value and worth. But if it is item for item, just a straight up trade, then as long as both parties are happy with the arrangement, that's okay, because that needle may matter to this person and that necklace may matter to that person, and that's fine if they wish to agree on that trade. As soon as it becomes a cash transaction, then we have to be sure that there is no fraud taking place. When, however, a person exchanged produce for produce, the laws of ona'ah do apply. 100 bags of wheat for 100 bags of apple, we do still have to work that, whether the produce is evaluated before the sale or after the sale, because produce was often used as a form of currency. People used the things they grew as one of their primary forms of commercial transaction, of buying and selling. Then we are obligated to treat agricultural products like that as being cash, and thus the laws of fraud are applicable. Now, this may seem very difficult. How does one make a living in this sort of situation? If I only have 1/6 to work with? Well, let's see. Although a person tells a colleague, we are completing this transaction on the condition that you do not hold me responsible for the unfair gain, for the possibility of having taken advantage, the laws of ona'ah apply, meaning in general, you cannot waive your rights to be treated fairly as a customer. The idea that you would go into a shop and the person says, no refunds, sold as is in some statement, would just not be a normal transaction in Jewish law and not be a legal transaction. You could still come back if it turned out that it was the wrong quantity, it was the wrong value, or there was some hidden fault in what you were buying. When does the above apply? Because there are some, we do need to narrow that down a little bit. When the statements are made without being explicit. In such an instance, the other party does not know how much money he is foregoing in favor of his colleague. If, however, one explicitly mentions the amount of unfair gain, the laws of ona'ah do not apply, because all conditions that are accepted by both parties are binding in cases of financial law. So if you go into the shop and the person says, I am selling this to you, and it is $8, but you should know the average price is $6, so you're giving up $2 for what would be the normal price. If you say, that's okay, I understand, I want to buy it anyway, then it's okay. But you have to know exactly how much you are giving up. It can't just be that the seller has that information and the buyer is in the dark. If you inform them and they are happy to waive their right to complain about that afterwards, then yes, the purchase will stand, even though technically they have overpaid for the item. Questions or comments so far? Okay. So you should be getting an idea here that we do have a lot of regulation, and indeed this is very important. The court is obligated to regulate prices and appoint officers of the law so that people at large will not be able to reap whatever profit they desire. Instead, the court should regulate that a person should earn only a profit of 1/6. A seller should not profit more than 1/6 of his investment. Meaning if you have gone out and you bought the apples from the farmer and you come to the market and you want to sell them, once you take into account the costs that you had to pay for the seller, to the buyer, what you had to pay for the farmer and transportation, etc., the profit that you make on top of that should not be more than 1/6 of that total amount. And that is something that would be investigated. If somebody was found to be taking a larger profit, they would be in trouble with the court. So yes, whatever the market will bear is not a Jewish concept. The marketplace is meant to be regulated in a way that will make it helpful and beneficial to all of the people in the market, not only those that have the opportunity to reap the greatest rewards. there needs to be a limit. Profit is fine, but a modest profit, not an unlimited profit. However, as we're going to see, there are some differences that can allow for more open-ended profit taking. When does the above apply? With regards to articles on which our lives depend. Wine, oil, and flour, these are things that were all part of the essential foods of the ancient world. And yes, wine was a common and essential food. With regard to spices and the like, by contrast, a set limit is not established by the court. The seller may take any measure of profit he desires. So if you want to be a person that can make whatever profit you feel like, sell diamonds, right? Sell fancy spices. Those are things that nobody needs. If somebody wants to pay you a stupid amount of money for it, that's between you and them and their stupidity. But when it comes to things like, well, in the modern world, we would call it things like the staples, the milk and bread and eggs, things that people need on a regular basis to be able to eat and sustain themselves. There is a cap for what profit can be made, and that ensures that nobody is being exploited in the process of getting what they need for their daily life. During this particular time when inflation is going up quite rapidly and many people are facing difficulties, while at the same time profits are going up for many companies well beyond a sixth, this is something that should be brought to mind. But once you've purchased it, there is still a implied warranty, if you will. Whenever there is a blemish that the people of a city agree is serious enough to warrant the nullification of a transaction, the article should be returned. Whenever the people agree that a fault is not considered to be a blemish, the article should not be returned, unless the purchaser explicitly stated that he refused to accept even the slightest blemish. The rationale is that whenever a person conducts business without making any specific demands, it is assumed that he is following the prevailing customs of the community. We go back to our apple seller. I want to buy 100 apples. I get home, and as I'm looking through them, I notice that a number of them are bruised. Can I go back and demand that my bruised apples be exchanged for perfect apples? Probably not. Most of us understand that a few bruises on an average apple is perfectly normal, and that's not really a blemish that is worth nullifying the entire purchase. On the other hand, if I get home and I open up my apples and half of them are rotten and no longer edible, then absolutely that is the kind of thing the average person would say, that's not right, that's not fair, and I should be getting my money back for the rotten apples that I was sold. However, even the bruised apples could be an issue if, when I bought them, I told the seller, I will only buy the apples from you that are absolutely perfect. I don't want to see any bruised items at all. And the seller says, sure, and gives me 100 apples. And then when I get home, I notice that some are bruised. Yes, because I made a explicit stipulation that they had to be perfect, then they had to be perfect. That was a condition of the sale. It's a condition that needs to be upheld. If it won't be upheld, then the articles need to be returned and the money given back to the buyer. Whenever a person purchases an article without making any specific statements, it is assumed that he desired to purchase an article that is perfect without any blemish. In general, like we saw, some blemishes don't really count as blemishes, some are more obvious. Even if the seller explicitly said, this article is sold to you on the condition that you do not return it as blemished, the as-is condition, the purchaser may nevertheless return the article, unless the purchaser, the buyer, says, I accept any blemish that I will discover in this article, although it causes it to be worth such and such less. For when a person waives money that is due him, he must know how much he is waiving and make an explicit statement to that effect, as applies with regards to the laws of ona'ah, of taking advantage and defrauding. So you're absolutely allowed to say, I'm selling you these apples as is, and the purchaser can say, I take them as is, knowing that the bruised apples will be worth 20 cents less than the perfect apples, or whatever it might be. As long as I am stating explicitly what I'm giving up, then my giving it up is considered legally valid. If I don't say what I'm giving up and you don't tell me what I'm giving up, then it's not as is, because I still may be tricked. And it could be that I get home, look at it, and realize I have given up much more than I expected. And that means that the sale is void. I know that in Latin they have caveat emptor, buyer beware. That is not a Jewish concept. In Judaism, both buyer and seller have legal recourse if they feel they have been taken advantage of. You can't just say, haha, I win in the sale. That's not the way Jewish business works. Before we move into theft, any questions about this very, very superficial discussion of buying and selling? Okay, theft. Whenever a person steals something worth more than a pruta, which is about a penny's worth, he has sinned. He must repay. The Torah prohibits stealing even the smallest amount, meaning you are forced by law to have to repay if you have taken a penny or more, but stealing even less than that is still forbidden by the Torah. It's merely that the court doesn't have the tools to be able to deal with amounts that small. It is forbidden to steal as a joke, planning to return it or pay. All is forbidden in case you get used to such behavior. It drives me absolutely crazy when I see people swiping things from other people as a joke and saying, oh, I was going to give it back to them tomorrow. No, not funny. And you should not get in the habit of taking things that belong to someone else in any case, even if you think it's just going to be for a laugh. What is a thief? One who takes someone's money secretly, without the knowledge of the owner, such as one who puts his hand into his neighbor's bag and takes money without the owner seeing it, and similar cases. But if he takes it openly and publicly by force, he is considered not a thief, but a robber. Those are two different technical categories for ways of taking something. Thieves do it by secrecy, robbers do it more bluntly in the technical language of the Torah. When convicted, he must pay twice the amount stolen or its worth. If he returns the property without being convicted, he pays no additional fines. So if you reach into your neighbor's bag at work and you take out $20, you get home, you feel guilty. The next day you come back and you say, I'm so sorry, I took this, here's your $20 back. Then it is okay and everything is fine. If, on the other hand, you get home and there is a knock on the door and the police show up, when the police demand that you repay, you're going to be repaying $40, a double amount for what you stole. So if you are doing it of your own will, then you only have to repay what you took, or the exact value of what you took if something has happened to the particular item that was stolen. If you are forced to give it back by the court, then you are paying twice as much as a penalty. Anyone who steals so much as a pruta from someone else is as though he takes away his life. That's a rather strong statement. Proof, as it is said, so are the ways of everyone that is greedy of gain, and that thus take away the life of the owners, from Proverbs. And also, and he shall eat up your harvest and your bread, that your sons and daughters should eat. Jeremiah, talking about stealing someone else's harvest, means you are literally stealing food from their children. And further, for the violence against the children of Judah, because they have shed innocent blood in their land. And it is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites in an act that can be considered as theft. So, where do we find that Saul killed the Gibeonites? Since he killed Nob, the city of priests, and that city would provide them with water and food, Scripture regards him as though he had personally killed them, even though all he did was deprive them of those that were supporting them. That is the equivalent, morally, of actually putting your hand against their throat. Judaism takes theft very seriously. You are not merely taking away someone's possessions, you are taking away things that are essential for their life. And to what lengths do we go to avoid theft? Well, here we get a rather extreme example. Stonecutters are not subject to the laws of robbery, meaning if they keep the chips. Just think for a second. You buy a big block of marble and you say to the stonecutter, I want you to carve this to be a bookend to hold my books on the shelf. The stonecutter gets to work and he carves them into the shape you desired. Well, you own the block of marble, but you end up with a bookend that's going to be carved smaller. That's what they're doing. Well, the chips, the actual pieces that have been chiseled off, technically we don't have to worry about who owns those. Those can be ignored. The stonemason doesn't have to spread a special cloth and gather them up as he's carving so that he can give them back to the customer. We don't worry about those chips. Technically, they may belong to the original customer, but we're not going to concern ourselves with it. Maybe. Workers who trim shrubs or cut vines or weed plants or thin vegetables, if the household cares about the waste, are subject to the laws of robbery. But if not, then what they cut belongs to them. So those types of things, what is being cut could be of value to the householder for compost or some other purpose, perhaps weaving the vines into baskets, in which case, if you hire someone to cut your vines, they have to leave the vines behind if those were the instructions. On the other hand, if you don't care what happens to the vines, then the people who cut them are allowed to keep them and transport them away, either to throw them away or to use them themselves. As you can see, when engaging in this type of transaction, you should be clear on what you consider yours and what you are not concerned with. And in such a way, we avoid the conflicts that can happen. If you're hiring someone to cut your trees, ask them who is expected to clear away all of the cuttings, who gets to keep the wood, and all of those topics. Make sure that you're both on the same page before the business begins, and that way there won't be any tension from a misunderstanding. Tzedakah is not technically a money issue in the sense that although we consider tzedakah, which is often translated as charity, to be a gift of money from those who have some to those who have less, tzedakah can actually be done in a variety of ways. We've talked in many of my other classes, in Torah class and Mishnah in particular, about the laws of the field, of leaving the corners and the gleanings and the forgotten sheaves. And we've talked about the topics of tithing as well. But for tonight, I want to talk about more of the spontaneous acts of tzedakah. We see in the book of Deuteronomy, if anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Now, notice first that we have an obligation to help because God is telling us that if we didn't help, that we would be heartless in that act. Notice also that it uses the term lend. Lending in Jewish law is done without interest. So if I lend you $100, you give me back $100 when we're done, and nothing else is added to it. And that is because most lending in Jewish history was done as a way of helping somebody in need. And often because the person who was lending didn't have the amount to give it as a gift. So they could help, but they couldn't give it away. And thus a loan was the more logical way of handling it. This is also a reminder that even if you don't have a lot to give, you may still have ways to help someone else in need. And just because you don't have free money to give as gifts doesn't mean you're off the hook from trying to help other people. Leviticus, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger so that they can continue to live among you. Judaism believes that we want our community to remain intact, and one of the best ways to make sure that happens is if people who are having a financial difficulty are supported by the other members of the community. Now, how much do we give? Well, Ketuvot, the Talmud gives us some parameters. Said Rav Ila, in Usha, sages ordained that he who wants to distribute his possessions may not do so more than with a fifth of them. So too it has been taught on Tanaic authority, he who wants to distribute his possessions may not do aspect of their character, there is a limit in our tradition that a person should not give away more than 20% of what they own, because if they do so, they themselves may come to need tzedakah, charity, to support themselves, and a person should not put themselves in that position. But still, 20% from as a maximum from among the community should be sufficient to help everyone. How much do we expect the people who are in need to regulate themselves? Well, as we see, when a person has enough food for 2 meals, it is forbidden for him to take from the tamhui. When a person has enough food for 14 meals, he should not take from the kupah. If he has 200 zuz, even if he does not invest or do business with them, or 50 zuz that he invests, he should not take shicha, peah, or the tithes for the poor. If he has money in hand, but he owes a debt or is under the lien to his wife for her ketubah, he is permitted to take. This is a very lengthy way of putting it, and with terminology that is perhaps less familiar to us in the modern world. But if somebody has enough food to get them through the day, 2 meals, then they're not allowed to go to the emergency food bank that was set up in the ancient world, the tamhui. If someone has enough food for a week, 14 meals, then they could not take from the kupah, which is more of the long-term financial fund for the community. If they have 200 zuz or 50 zuz that they are investing so that it's earning some return from the buying and selling, then the forgotten sheaf and the corners and the tithing that comes from the poor, those are off limits to such a person. That is the sort of poverty line, if you will, for taking from those other things. So a person who doesn't even have 2 meals could take from all 3. A person who has 14 meals could only take from the agricultural leftovers. So there is a scale. We don't help everybody as much as everyone. We help people who are in most desperate need most, those in moderate need next, and those with sustained need further. And that allows everyone to prioritize the resources of the community to make sure that we give as much need as possible to those in need at different degrees. When a poor person is in need, but owns a courtyard and a household utensils, even silver and golden utensils, we do not obligate him to sell his house and his personal possessions. Instead, he is permitted to accept charity, tzedakah, and it is a mitzvah to give to him. So, just because somebody has hit hard times and they are looking for help doesn't mean they have to liquidate all their assets down to a 0 bank account before we are going to help them. Even if they have a house, which in the ancient world was a real piece of property and wealth, that doesn't mean we force them to sell the house before we help them. We help them straight away. However, there are some limitations. When does the above apply? With regard to eating utensils, drinking utensils, clothing, bedding, and the like. If, however, he owns a golden comb or a pestle and the like, he should sell them and buy less valuable ones. So we're not going to force a person who has beautiful silverware to sell the silver. Instead, if they have, because they use those to eat. If they're not using them to eat, then yes, we can ask them to sell them before they get help from the community. But if they have other trivial trinkets that are valuable but not necessary for normal life, then we can ask them to sell that. So even if they have clothing or other things that seem far above their station now that they're on hard times, we don't make them sell those things just so that they have to wear or use something worse. We only have them sell things that are not being used. When does the above apply? Before he has descended to the level where he takes charity from people at large, meaning begging on the street. Once he collects charity from the community, we obligate him to sell his utensils and purchase lesser ones and then accept charity. If you are going to go door to door begging, then yes, we do need you to reduce your current wealth with regards to your utensils. You don't have to sell your house, but absolutely, if you're going to be in line taking from people door to door, then we don't want the people who don't even have those utensils to go without because you have joined them in the asking. We do ask you to balance here, the interests of the community and the interests of the poor. There is meant to be accommodation from both sides. And as such, the community can prosper and do well. And one more limitation on those that are in need, this again from the Mishnah Torah, one should always restrain himself and submit to privation rather than be dependent upon other people or cast himself upon public tzedakah. For thus have the sages commanded us, saying, make the Sabbath a weekday rather than be dependent on other people. So yes, you have the right to ask other people for financial assistance, but if you have any way at all to try and support yourself, it is best that you try to do that first. Even if one is a sage held in honor, once he becomes impoverished, he should engage in a trade, be it even a loathsome trade, rather than be dependent upon other people. No matter what you think your honor and dignity is, there is no job that is too embarrassing for you. Work at any job that, even one that you think might be humiliating, rather than ask other people for support if you can. Obviously, even if you're working at a job that's not that's embarrassing to you and you still need help, of course, you should still ask for help. It is better to skin hides off animal carcasses, considered one of the worst jobs in the ancient world, than to say to other people, I am a great sage, I am a priest, sustain me. So did the sages command us. Among the great sages, there were hewers of wood, carriers of beams, drawers of water to irrigate gardens, and workers in iron and charcoal. All of those were considered very menial and not very dignified jobs, and very messy, and some of them dangerous. They did not ask for public assistance, nor did they accept it when offered to them. So there is this obligation for the dignity of work, and a person should be honored for the work they do, even if it is not considered a prestigious job. Whoever so is in no need of tzedakah, but deceives the public and does accept them, will not die of old age until he is indeed becomes dependent upon other people. So what it is saying is that if somebody is advantage of the community's goodwill, they will eventually suffer real poverty. He is included among those whom the scripture says, cursed is the man that trusts in man, from Jeremiah. On the other hand, whosoever is in need of tzedakah and cannot survive unless he accepts them, such as a person who is of advanced age or ill or afflicted with sore trials, but is too proud and refuses to accept them, is the same as a shedder of blood and is held to account for his own soul. And by his suffering, he gains nothing but sin and guilt. Unfortunately, many people seem to have the idea that if they ask for help, that they are less of a man, less of a self-reliant individual. If you actually need help, and it is your pride or your arrogance that is keeping you from accepting help, then you are not blessed in the eyes of God. God is not saying, wow, how tough he is by letting himself starve to death rather than ask for help. God is saying, you're an idiot, and you're basically killing yourself for no good reason. If you are in need and you truly need that help, do not be arrogant, do not be too proud to accept that help. Ask, accept, and be grateful that you're part of a community that can help sustain you. And of course, if you are in a position to help others, do not think that they should be proud and refuse help. Don't think that they are wrong for asking for help. That is exactly what a community is meant to do. Those with a little more can help those with a little less. And as the cycle of life and generations pass, all can be in a position to help everyone else. No man is ever impoverished by tzedakah, nor does evil or harm befall anyone by reason of it. As it is said, and the work of righteousness shall be peace. You're not going to go broke taking care and helping other people. And you're not going to suffer because of it. Instead, as the Torah said, do not be hard-hearted, open your hand and help others in need. And as I also mentioned, don't be so stubborn that you don't open your mouth and ask for help if you are in need. If a poor man asks you for tzedakah and you have nothing to give him, comfort him with words. It is forbidden to rebuke, to criticize or yell at a poor man, or to raise one's voice in a shout at him, saying that his heart is broken and crushed, as scripture says, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. And again, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. Woe unto him who shames the poor. Woe unto him. One should rather be unto the poor as a father, with both compassion and words, as it is said, I was a father to the needy, from the book of Job. Again, too often people look down on those that are poor, they criticize them, they blame, do interpret poverty because of their own mistakes. That is no reason for us to despise them, and it is no reason for us to shame them. They are already in a difficult situation. It is up to us to find the way to both help them and help them escape that poverty in the long term. Are there any questions or comments before we wrap it up for today? All right, then. Let's go ahead and I'll see you next week. Remember, next week is our final class for this year, 5782. And I hope you'll all be able to join me because we will be talking about the high holidays, which is the transition from 5782 to 5783. So see you once more next week.